Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In this section, we will explore the theme of sibling conflict in the Bible by looking at the stories of Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau. Within these narratives, we will explore the archetypes of the farmer and the shepherd and how they impact our understanding of salvation history. Additionally, we will look at the story of Abraham and how he embodied the true meaning of what it means to be Hebrew. To start off, in his book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, Yoram Hazony, who is an Israeli scholar and philosopher, recognizes two archetypes, two life orientations that immediately become depicted after the fall of humanity in Genesis. For Hazony, this dichotomy is depicted first in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain represents what is called the farmer, while Abel represents the shepherd archetype. The farmer archetype is defined as an orientation of submission to authority. This is because for Hazony, Cain's response to the curse of Genesis 3:17-19 was to submit to it as unchanging. According to the curse in Genesis, we read, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you are taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." Hazony writes that Cain has piously accepted the curse on the soil, and God's having sent Adam to work the soil as unchangeable. His response is to submit as his father did before him, and within the framework of this submission, he initiates ways of giving up of what little he has as an offer of thanksgiving. In the eyes of the biblical author, Cain represents the life of the farmer, a life of pious submission, obeying in gratitude the custom that has been handed down, which alone provides bread so that man may live. Abel, on the other hand, believed in redemption, that things can possibly change and that we should not doom ourselves to the curse of sin as being an unremovable reality. Again, according to Hazony, Abel sees that the ground has been cursed and that man can only eat bread if he serves the ground. But sheep can feed themselves without human toil. And so if a man will keep sheep, he can free himself from serving the accursed ground. Abel was, in other words, has found a way to escape the curse upon the soil. Thus, God accepted Abel's sacrifice as being better than Cain's because Abel showed initiative that sought to heal and liberate humanity from its fallen state instead of being resigned and chained to it. Now, it should be recognized that farming in itself is not a bad thing any more than herding in itself is a better thing. But for the ancients, the two economic models symbolized a greater orientation of power that the two systems and mindsets would give rise to. Hazony notes that after Cain kills Abel, he goes on to find the first city. In the Bible, the association of Cain with the rise of the city is not arbitrary at all. In fact, it is of great significance. For the ultimate fruit of the way of the farmer, in the eyes of the biblical narrative, is the city that grows out of it. It is the city, with its extraordinary accumulation of wealth and power, that is the logical consequence of the farming life associated with Cain. Indeed, the story of Cain's murder of Abel may in fact be preserved memories of hunter-gatherer and nomadic populations who found themselves in conflict with rising agricultural civilizations as they were pushed more and more into the periphery of the civilizing world. Such a memory can very much be correlated with the Neolithic revolution that spread from Mesopotamia to other parts of Asia, Europe, and Africa. So as civilization began to be planted in these regions, people began to turn to farming. And as people began to turn to farming, we began to see these civilizations be put in place. They come into being and they start gaining, monopoly and power over the land, which then created all of these systemic inequalities that resulted from humans, living in harmony with the land and what we saw in Genesis to a fall out of harmony into what we see as a generational curse of sin. Although we tend to see the Neolithic Revolution as a time of progress, the biblical writers seem to have remembered it as being a curse, as people went from living off the land to being chained to it at the hands of exploitative regimes. As is the case today, progress came at a cost, which is usually paid in the lives of exploited people. So during this time, this is when we start seeing people becoming slaves and peasants to people who are stronger than them, to the nobles, to the army, to the generals, to the high priests. We begin to see these systemic inequalities of people who have power now exploiting people who didn't and using them as cattle in a way. Zoni notes that in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, the imperial state engaged in public works on an unprecedented scale to increase the land available for farming, creating ever greater wealth and power. To achieve this, they employed their populations as slaves for periods of weeks or months when important projects were underway. This enforced management of hundreds of thousands of people was considered a form of taxation, which necessitated the creation of a large military apparatus capable of enforcing the impressment of multitudes into service and defending the public works against nomadic peoples who coveted the wealth and power being accumulated in the river valleys. It also led to the spectacular enrichment of the king and his court, as represented by physical structures such as the pyramids in Egypt or the ziggurats of Babylonia, and to the view that the king was a descendant of the gods, their principal servant and their chief priests, wherever he was not himself a deity. This then ties into the submission mentality that Hazoni ties to the farmer mindset. The values that support the functioning of such regimes involve respect and deference to authority, traditionalism, obedience, the centralization of power, and accepting inequality and hierarchy as being the natural order of things. All these characteristics appear in a concentrated form in the story of the Tower of Babylon, in which the rulers of Babylon, the most important city in the basin of the Euphrates, decide that all of humanity is to be mustered into a single city, with a single language and a single monomaniacal aim, the conquest of heaven. The life of the city and of the state, then, is for the biblical narrative the natural extension of the way of the farmer. All the virtues that we find in Cain, submission to the decrees of the gods, pious sacrifice and self-sacrifice, honoring the customs of past generations, are brought to perfection in the great cities and their empires. The values of the farmer are therefore imperial values that allowed for and gave rise to the subjection and exploitation of individuals. Oscar Garcia Johnson, another biblical scholar, concurs with imperialistic symbology of the Tower of Babel, writing that the taste of a strong will, patriotic pride, and exceptionalism attract people from all walks of life in the world looking for salvation and progress in the global tower. The citizens of the global tower, likewise, have convinced themselves that they have been historically chosen to illustrate progress and civility, which entitles them to rule over the earth. The structure is clearly branded, carrying within the image of the builders and the name of the makers of civilization. The splendor of the achievement is to inspire admiration, fear, and respect. and the ultimate goal is to inspire a godlike loyalty from admirers and subjects. However, while the values of Cain the farmer, who became both the first murderer and city dweller, contain what may be called imperialist or centralist values, or a theology of glory, Abel was seen as embodying the values of the shepherd. Contrary to the farmer, the shepherd stands as an antithesis, in that while the farmer stands for structure, order, submission, and authority, the shepherd stands for liminality, openness, freedom, and even creativity. According to Azoni again, Abel represents the life of the shepherd, which is a life of descent and initiative, whose aim is to find the good life for man, which is presumed to be God's true will. All the virtues we find in Abel, his descent from the supposedly unalterable decrees of the gods, his hesitation to accept that which is customary as authoritative, and his keen interest in innovation in order to improve things, are by the same token anathema in the world of the god kings, who rule the cities and their empires, and seen as abominations. The nomad views civilization from the outside, looking down from the hills at the doings of society and state as he charts his own independent course through the wilderness. The splendor and lies of urban life are of little worth to him, and even less the beast life of the farmers and the fields, living out their days in toil, that these lies may be fed. The nomads have what is more precious to them than all else: independence, political independence, and that they live as nomads, ungoverned, their labor and their property and their actions unregulated and untaxed by anyone other than themselves, ethical independence, and that their vantage point and the freedom and dignity of their work allow them to focus on what truly matters. Thus, when we later see Abraham and Sarah being called to leave behind the heart of civilization in Sumer, we see that in being called to become nomads, they were being called into a greater vision of life, an alternative outside and beyond the centers of power, to discover a more authentic and humane way of being, as the writer of Hebrews testifies. They confess that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. In essence, Abraham was called to become an immigrant. In the modern day, immigrants may be the best examples of the shepherd archetype, and that they, like Abraham, especially those from afflicted countries, are people who see the farmer states around them and dream of finding a better world, a heavenly one, that has a better future for them and their loved ones, and it is for this reason that they come here seeking freedom and opportunity, and are sometimes criminalized for doing so. In fact, Abraham and Sarah's marginalized experience is perhaps the origin of the word Hebrew. In Genesis 14:13, Abraham is called an Ivri, which is translated as Hebrew. However, S.A. West, another scholar, observes that the word Ivri itself may be derived from the Hebrew word ever or ever, which means the other side, referring to how Abraham came from the other side of the Jordan or Euphrates. In essence, Abram and his family were identified as being foreigners, people from the other side of the river or the other side of the border. Interestingly, there exists a possible cognate in ancient Egyptian and Ugaritic in the form of Apiru or Habiru, which according to the scholar J. Louis may derive from the Semitic word aber, which again means one who has crossed over or immigrant. This is significant because we commonly use the word Hebrew to denote an ethnic identity, but in reality, its origins connote a socio-economic identity, namely that of a foreigner or an immigrant of any origin or background. This is again significant because there is extensive documentation of how Habiru were viewed and treated in Egyptian and Ugaritic documents. Habiru evidently occupied a marginalized position in these societies. They were almost always described as foreigners who, in desperation, had to hire themselves out in servitude or slavery. Their social status varies from place to place, but with the exception of that of a few individuals, it is an inferior one. In Egypt and at Nuzu, they are virtually slaves. At Alalach, the individual Habiru may occupy a prominent rank, but the majority are inferior to the peasantry. Hittite Habiru are ranked between the freeborn and the slaves. Very often the Habiru are foreigners. According to S.A. West, among 4,000 tablets were found at Nuzi. More than 30 refer to the Habiru, but depict them as persons hiring themselves out as servants in exchange for food and clothing, a kind of self-enslavement. And again, characteristic of Habiru is that they are almost always dependents, either on the state, city, or other individuals. In Egypt, they perform forced labor for the crown at Nuzi. In Mesopotamia, both male and female Habiru offer their services to a master in exchange for their keep. So when we read about Abraham selling his wife to local kings, as expressed in Genesis 12:11 to 16, or in Genesis chapter 20, what we may be witnessing is Abraham's precarious position as a Habiru, who for survival reasons felt compelled to trade his wife in order to receive protection from a powerful patron, similarly to how other Habiru at the time felt compelled to sell themselves to powerful patrons in order to have security. Since men do not leave their native lands and enter an alien society as dependents, or hover on the fringes of their own society as outlaws and rebels, unless they are forced to, the Habiru must have been men under duress. In fact, fear for his survival as a vulnerable foreigner is explicitly cited as a motivation in Genesis 12:11 to 13 and again in Genesis 20:11. We read in Genesis 12:11 to 16, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, This is his wife. Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. Another service that Habiru provided were that of mercenaries. Most commonly, however, the Habiru serve as soldiers, often organized in special contingents. It is in this role that we find them in Larsa in Babylonia, Mari on the middle Euphrates, Alalach in North Syria, and Burg Hazkui in Anatolia. West concurs, adding, more often depicted as military auxiliaries used by local rulers as marauding warriors, some of them nevertheless settled down in towns, where they hired themselves out as servants. This again is a function that we see Abraham doing in Genesis 14:13 to 24, where Abraham fights as a Habiru and proxy fighter on behalf of the king of Sodom, though Abraham decides to show honor by declining payment for his rescue mission. In the face of common depictions of Habiru as servile underlings, perhaps it was necessary for Abram's own pride and dignity to establish himself as being more noble than a regular sellsword. In Genesis 14 to 13 to 24, we read, Then one who had escaped and came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and routed them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all of the goods, and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods, and the women and the people. After his return, the king of Sodom went out to meet him. The king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said, So that you might not say, I have made Abram rich, I will take nothing. So in other words, Abraham didn't want to be known as just another mercenary. He rejected payment so that he could say he did this because he thought it was the right thing to do. He wasn't looking to follow the stereotype of being another Hebrew mercenary. But to return to Sang-Hyun Lee's notion of liminality, he writes, God chooses the liminal margins of this world as the strategic place to begin God's decisive work of carrying out God's own end in creation. God chooses to work through liminal, marginalized people in order to love and redeem all fallen humanity. This is because marginalized people, though sinful themselves, possess a more heightened liminality than those of the dominant centers of the world, and thus a little more openness to God's good news. In other words, people who exist on the edges, on the margins of society, the weak, the powerless, these are the ones who are the most likely to respond to the good news that comes from God, since living on the forefront of the world of sin and suffering, they recognize the most how and why the world needs to change and turn back to the way of God. This is confirmed in Scripture, where St. Paul writes, Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were noble of birth. But God chose what is foolish in this world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in this world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one may boast in the presence of God. In other words, God chooses the weak, the lowly, the people who are on the edges, on the margins of society, to be God's agents of change, to humble the strong, to bring people back into right relationship with God. Since a part of liminality is about stepping outside of structure so as to gain a better perspective of what is wrong within it, to become liminal means moving into the margins. Thus, those who live on the margins of society, the edges of the circle, are more able to step into liminality than those who are more anchored at the center of the circle. Those who lack good news are those who are the most likely to positively respond to it. But just because one is closer towards the edge does not make stepping beyond the boundary any more pleasant. To leave the circle is to enter uncertainty and vulnerability. However, it is also entering mystery and new possibilities. When Abraham left his security at home, he entered the insecurity of liminality. Though Abraham dreamed of finding a new home, what he actually found was trial and peril. Though he would eventually die without receiving on earth the promise of a new home, he still saw a vision of the heavenly city and greeted it from afar. This happened in part when God made a covenant with Abraham, through a sign of the Exodus, when God would use a band of Hebrew ex-slaves, Abraham's descendants, as a ragtag force to change the world. In Genesis 15:12-15, plus 17, we read, As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in good old age. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And when we eventually read about the story of the Exodus, we see that God led his people out of Egypt as what? As a pillar of clouds during the day, and as a pillar of fire at night, in mimesis of the smoking firepot and the flaming torch that passed through the separated pieces that were the sacrificed animals of this covenant, to signify God leading his people through the separated Red Sea and through the wilderness into a promised land. And this promise was only received after Abraham allowed himself to enter the unknown of liminality, the deep, terrifying darkness, so as to find a birth of new light to carry back home to a lightless world and mimesis of God's own creation of the world. As it is written, In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the water. Then God said, Let there be light, and there was light. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. God became liminal by entering into the darkness, so that life and light can be born from within it. Likewise, liminality means entering into the darkness, so as to find a new light, to bring back into the center, so as to create new life from within the structures that have fallen to become devoid of it. Thus, Abraham is told that his descendants, like himself, will become Habiru, marginal and vulnerable to the chains of society. But despite this, God will lead them as they cross over from the other side of slavery and death to bring about a rebirth of new life in the world, sealing this promise with a foreshadowing of the pillar of fire and smoke that will lead them to the other side of the waters and through the wilderness to a promised land. Now, when we look at the life of Jacob, Abraham's grandson and eventual namesake of Israel, we see this pattern of marginalization and return played out as a foretaste. If we return to the archetype of the two siblings, the farmer and the shepherd, we see that God sides with the shepherd, not to spite the farmer, but to humble the farmer, so that the relationship between the siblings can be restored to communitas. In the story of Esau and Jacob, we see Esau play the part of the farmer and Jacob play the part of the shepherd. This is because Esau is described as being a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So pay attention to the details here. In that Esau is described as being a man of the field. He was a farmer, just like Cain was. Meanwhile, Jacob is described as a quiet man, living in tents. And it should be remembered that only nomads live in tents because they're moving around. They have to pack up and leave, and so they can't just build permanent structures. And so here we see this archetype being present within these two brothers. Already, Esau is described as following the path of Cain. He is first a farmer like Cain. Second, like Cain, he is associated with violence by being a skillful hunter, a description that was also used for Nimrod, which in Genesis it states was first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. With Nimrod likewise also being associated with rebuilding civilization as Cain did, and giving rise to the Tower of Babel. Scripture states, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah, that is, the great city. So here again, we see Esau being described as following the way of Cain in terms of being associated with violence in the same way that Cain and Nimrod was, since Esau is also being described as being a great hunter. Thus, with Esau being compared to these two men, he was therefore prized and loved by the patriarchy as expressing exceptionally masculine values. Hence, it is written that Isaac loved Esau, while Jacob is implied to be more feminine in comparison. He was described as being a more domestic, indoor kind of person, which is associated with the role of women and being indoor and domestic. Thus, his being favored by his mother. Indeed, just as sin caused Eve to become subject to Adam as a curse, which we can read in Genesis 3:16, so did the privileged elder brother treat his younger brother in a way that implied a servile status. As once, we read in Scripture, as once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." So that we see Esau seeing Jacob as something like a domestic servant, if not an ironic housewife. And yet, we read in Scripture, though one shall be stronger than the other, the elder shall serve the younger. In other words, we already see this theme of God working through the weak to humble the strong. This came to be when Jacob got Esau to sell him his birthright and then later swindled his way to receiving his blessing from Isaac. This then resulted in his becoming liminal, in that after receiving God's blessing, he was made to leave the circle of his family to become a habiru, a fugitive outside of it. A fugitive because, like Cain, Esau sought to kill him because of his divine favor. This is what solidified Jacob as both the heir to Abraham and to Abel, in that he took up the life and archetype of the shepherd, and questioning the status quo by daring to dream of a better world and becoming persecuted because of it. Prefiguring his descendants, Jacob spends time serving a master in a foreign land as a habiru, as a sign that God's chosen are not called to glory, but to humility and service. Through his time in liminality as a shepherd, he comes back as the father of a nation, after getting the best of his uncle, who prefigured Pharaoh as a person who sought to unfairly exploit his labor. Not only did he come back as the father of the 12 tribes, but he also came back with a lesson for all marginalized people, namely that they can do all things through the power of God. When Jacob was cheated by Laban, for example, it was God who gave him justice. In Genesis 31, chapter 31, we read, Laban said, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "Let me pass through all of your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages." Laban said, "Good, let it be as you have said." But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all of the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob was pasturing the rest of Laban's flock. Then Jacob took fresh rods, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks produced young that were striped, speckled, and spotted. So in this specific example, Laban tries to exploit Jacob by denying him the wages that he was due, by taking away all of the goats and sheep that Jacob had the right to claim, and hiding them so that when Jacob came upon the flocks, he couldn't find anything that he could claim as his own. And so we later read in Genesis that God gave Jacob a dream, which inspired him to do this kind of miracle, this flock breeding thing, to get the striped, speckled, and spotted sheep and lambs that was owed to him. So here we see God giving justice to the oppressed foreigner who's being treated unfairly. When Jacob decided to flee with his family back to Canaan, it was God who prevented Laban from harming Jacob as a foreshadow of God delivering his descendants at the Red or Reed Sea. Again, we read in Genesis 31, "So he fled with all that he had. Starting out, he crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled, so he took his kinsfolk with him and pursued him for 7 days until he caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, 'Take heed that you say not a word to Jacob, either good or bad.'" So again, Jacob tries to flee back to Canaan in the same way that the Israelites tried to flee from Pharaoh, leaving Egypt, so they can also return to Canaan. And just as Pharaoh tried to take back the Israelites, Laban tried to chase down Jacob. But in both cases, God intervened to save and deliver them so that they can be free. Finally, when Jacob was overshadowed by fear and doubt over his coming confrontation with his brother, God came to give him courage by showing him that he was stronger than he realized, telling him, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Not only does Israel mean the one who strives with God, but more plainly, it means in Hebrew, God strives. Not only did God show Jacob that all this time he had been striving against gods and men, but God too was striving with him and for him, so that they could overcome the powers of the world together, and that God remains our partner in the struggle for the world's liberation and salvation. It takes great courage to leave home and enter liminality, but it takes greater courage to return back into the circle, especially if one's original place within it was less than optimal. But God does not call us to become independent of others or even dependent on something else. Rather, God calls us out so that we may gain a better perspective on how to call others back into interdependence and restored right relationship. When Jacob left, he brought back others, namely his new family, which included Leah, who was previously unloved. And a kind of symmetry to Jacob and Esau, just as God chose to raise up Jacob because he was weaker and younger compared to his brother, so too did God raise up and honor Leah, who was older and less loved compared to her younger and more beautiful sister, which we read in Genesis 29:31 and Genesis 30 verse 20, thus showing that what the world rejects and shoves into the periphery, God embraces and lifts up to give great honor. So this sojourn really did then revitalize the people involved in it, as Jacob went from being a quiet indoor kid into a strong leader, blessed by God's grace, thus showing that God can do great things with little people. The ending of the Jacob and Esau arc is perhaps what Cain and Abel's should have been, which was a reconciliation that foreshadowed Joseph's and his brothers in Egypt, and even the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament, as Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept together. Because God's grace frees and empowers us to become love through the experience of God's love, we are therefore called to share that grace for the reconciliation and healing of others, as Jacob did not see God's grace as something to be exploited, but as something that frees and allows us to share God's blessings with others. As he says to his brother, again in Genesis 33, please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, because I have everything I want. Therefore, God chooses the marginalized to be God's agents of healing, since as wounded people themselves, they know and deeply understand what it means to be in need of healing. So to end this section, we see that God calls the marginalized to become God's agents of change and reconciliation in the world. Being called is not a place of glory, but a place of striving and humility. The imagery of Cain and Abel, of Esau and Jacob, point to a deeper truth that conflict should not be valorized as a black and white battle between good and evil, because God makes the point that the conflict is not between eternal foes, but lost siblings who were once mutual members of God's own family. It is not God's will to vanquish, but to heal, because God desires that all be saved and restored to right relationship, as even in the aforementioned and criticized farmer archetype, the individuals who find themselves in this mode are still children of the primordial light, even though that light may be hidden and covered by their sins. As Jacob said to his restored brother, truly, to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Although we were made to embody God's image, we have lost and covered it up within ourselves. Therefore, it is God's will to restore us to the divine light, so that we may reflect and embody the communitas, that is God's vision of right relationship between God and humanity, and between humans and with each other. Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob were conflicts between individuals, but if the state is man writ large, then justice is morality writ large, so that the stories of individuals serve as images and reflections of groups, which the Bible consciously implied by setting up the Exodus motifs within these individual stories. Thus, it is to the Exodus and Israel's liminal sojourn to Egypt that we should now turn to in the next section and the next part of this series.